Профессор Свидерски из университета Фрибура, Швейцарии, с докладом «Самоопределение или реакция на ценность. Кант, Соловьев, Шелер и Гарри Франкфурт о моральной психологии». Профессор Свидерски является главным редактором известного еще с советских времен журнала «Studies in Soviet Philosophy». Это был журнал, сейчас он называется «Studies in East European Thought». Пожалуйста.
In this presentation, I juxtapose and compare three philosophers, Vladimir Soloviev, Max Scheler, and a living philosopher, Harry Frankfurt. More exactly, I pair Soloviev and Scheler on the one hand and contrast their views to those of Frankfurt on the other hand. For obvious reasons, my approach is not historical and exegetical, but analytic and conceptual. I'm not a historian of philosophy. The issue for consideration is the nature of the human will and the source of normativity. The three philosophers that I want to consider have one feature in common, more or less. Kant stands in the background of their respective views. All directly or indirectly wrestle with the issue so central to Kant's moral philosophy, the determination of the will and autonomy. Neither of these philosophers entirely agrees with Kant's account of autonomy, but neither contests the idea of self-determination. Soloviev and Scheler appeal to a motivation generated by value insight, the attraction and response to the good. And this, they say, presupposes a certain kind of disposition, an attitude that suggests love. Harry Frankfurt, likewise, appeals to love, to the importance for us what we care about, without, however, conceding that this entails the existence of values. All three philosophers understand that the will is not simply given, it becomes. It is constructed, so to speak, and they seek to explain whether the construction is sui generis and self-centered, or whether, by virtue of a response to the good, by virtue of love, the will seeks beyond the confines of the mere self. Soloviev and Scheler adopt the latter perspective, which they understand as an essential corrective to Kant. They believe he failed to explain how his conception of autonomy motivates the will in the right way. Frankfurt pursues the former course, placing emphasis on the self-constitution of the will. He too can be said to correct Kant in that he feels he can show why our self-constitution is meaningful to us in the first place. In the end, the contrast between these positions is about our moral psychology. Do we need to appeal to antecedently given values to explain who and what we are as moral beings? Or is, to recall a famous song, love all you need? The contrast and comparison I have in view would be fortuitous were it not for these three common traits running through the works of these three philosophers, namely the long shadow of Kant, the nature of love, and the role it may play in the determination of the will. There may be other, perhaps more revealing accounts of our moral psychology, for example today the very popular status of evolutionary psychology. But I will proceed here on the assumption that these contrasting positions, the three I have in mind here, provide ample food for thought about the will without going further beyond them. Before proceeding, I need to say something about why I am pairing Soloviev and Scheler. The incentive to do so comes from a study published first in German by the Slavist and historian of Russian philosophy, Helmut Dahm. You see the title. It is a subtitle that attracts me, Ein Beitrag zur Geschichte der Phänomenologie. Soloviev is cast, in fact, by Dahm in the role of a precursor to the phenomenology Scheler developed with such acuity, namely the phenomenology of affective, or if you will, emotional consciousness. Dahm's purpose seems to have been to show that, although they do not by any means converge on all the important points in their respective philosophies, Scheler's work can be read as a constructive complement to Soloviev's late moral philosophy, without raising or answering the question, was Scheler in fact familiar with Soloviev? The Soloviev in question is mainly, though not exclusively, the Soloviev of the meaning of love, the justification of the good, and theoretical philosophy. In these works, Soloviev's Durchbruch zur Phänomenologie, to employ Dahm's phrase, comprises of material value ethics and act phenomenology, which were to be central to Scheler's own work. Where the early Soloviev philosophized from top down, so to speak, that is, from the standpoint of the absolute, constructing a religiously inspired metaphysics, the late Soloviev upended this approach and began philosophizing from the bottom up by attending to what he construed as direct moral experience present in our emotional life. He claimed that based on this evidence, he could draw important conclusions for moral philosophy and epistemology free of religious and metaphysical presuppositions. Personally, I doubt the latter claim. Although in his last decade, Soloviev did tone down the mystical character of some of his early work, religious and metaphysical inspiration remained prevalent. Personally, I am convinced. Mutatis mutandis, the same is true of Scheler's material value ethic and the anthropology he developed on its basis during the period when he was Germany's foremost Catholic philosopher. Dahm's comparison certainly relies on this affinity of the two philosophers for religious metaphysics. Now, as for Frankfurt, he is an analytic philosopher, though free of any of the ideologies that have from time to time afflicted Anglo-American philosophy. He has a refined psychological sense and practices a form of moral psychology that may well be set profitably alongside the phenomenology of motivation, though without the complex terminology that phenomenologists typically deploy. His work on the will extends across several decades and is encapsulated in his 2004 book, The Reasons of Love. You see the titles here. Frankfurt betrays no hint of interest, however, in religious metaphysics, a circumstance that perhaps counts against the comparison I have in mind. However, I think this lack of interest is all to the good. Frankfurt raises a straightforward question that neither Soloviev nor Scheler seem to have considered, perhaps because of their attraction to religious metaphysics. And that question is this: even were we to grant that our emotional life puts us in touch with value qualities, with the good, why should this be important to us? Why should we care about the experience of value and make it the basis of our will? This is the crux of the comparison I want to propose. Having set out what interests me now and identified the protagonists in the debate, I will dig deeper now into the several aspects of the matter, beginning with Soloviev and Scheler and ending with Harry Frankfurt. The central similarity between Soloviev and Scheler is the status each ascribed to values as the ground of normativity. Of course, Soloviev does not use the language of values, but this is the point about the vergleichende Interpretation between Soloviev and Scheler. Scheler is a complement, constructive complement to Soloviev. Values attract and direct the human will toward an overarching and all-inclusive moral order. The attraction in question is of the order of feeling, emotion. We are capable of being struck effectively by qualities to which we should not be indifferent. These are value qualities. Scheler, in this connection, wrote of a subjective ordo amoris, how each of us responds to these questions, to these qualities, and pursues the experience to the values they carry, reveals our personal disposition to the good, or failing that, our moral depredation. Soloviev seemingly believed that it lies in our nature first to recognize and then to participate in the realization of the overarching order of the good. Now, one way to state what Soloviev and Scheler were seeking to articulate about this kind of value experience, and this is my language, is that we owe it to ourselves to cultivate this form of experience. That to do so is to exercise and realize our potential as persons. For Scheler, this means passing beyond our inclinations or dispositions to spiritual participation in the objective ordo amoris that founds all value. Similarly, for Soloviev, the task consists in renouncing the egoism that blocks us from assenting to that which, though infinitely superior to us, is our end, the absolute good. To say that we owe something to ourselves suggests duty, obligation, as well as responsibility to ourselves beyond mere inclination and fancy, which are the wrong kind of motivators, at least as far as Soloviev and Scheler were concerned. Lurking in the background, as I said earlier, here is Kant's moral philosophy. explicitly countered by Soloviev, by Scheler, in the title of his famous book, Formalismus, and explicitly countered as well in some respects, I'll come back to this theme, by Soloviev. Each in his own way concludes that Kantian formalist or deontological ethics is incomplete. Kant's concept of the rational will, cleansed of mere inclination and bound by the moral law, needs to be corrected by a concept of moral insight, that is, recognition of and response to value. In Scheler's terms, values are the qualitative matter that Kant's abstract form of obligation needs if it is to be experientially concrete and motivationally effective. To be bereft of the experience of value, not to be capable of responding to value, is to be deprived of the fundamental connection humans have to their world, namely by this disposition called love, if you will. A loving response to the world is what we owe to ourselves. It impels us to seek after our own betterment. Now, correcting Kant in this way nevertheless retains the idea that the human will requires determination. That is, that there has to be a source of normativity. Something has to guide the construction of the human will. The question is whether this move to pass beyond Kant's compromises the question is rather whether this move to pass beyond Kant, the Scheler-Soloviev move, compromises his idea of the autonomy of the will. Autonomy, as he understood it, is the exercise of rationality in the ground of human dignity, as in the famous second formulation of the categorical imperative. Does value insight, grounded in love, foster autonomy? Or is determination by value insight, as you see there, thanks to our disposition to respond to the good, to love, in fact antithetical to autonomy? Kant tells us that autonomous determination of the will operates from within us. We constitute our will from within, of course not arbitrarily, but by recourse to reason. By contrast, appeal to value insight appears to entail external motivation, the determination of the will from without. Would this kind of determination not be what Kant condemned as heteronomy? If so, does love, so understood, take on a paradoxical hue? Does it not in fact reinforce the urge to heteronomy, abandonment to something other, something greater than I am? Both Soloviev and Scheler write of our response to value as enjoining essential necessity to which the will must submit. Is a statement from Scheler's formalism. If a value is self-given, willing becomes necessary in its being, according to laws of essential interconnections. And it is in this sense alone that Socrates' dictum is restored, that all good willing is founded in the cognition of the good, and that all evil willing rests on moral deception and aberration. Judgmental knowledge of moral norms is not determining for willing. Even the feeling of what is good determines willing only if the value is given adequately and evidentially, that is, only if it is self-given. What is wrong with Socrates' formulation is the rationalism, which implies that the mere concept of what is good has the power to determine the will. If all moral comportment is based on moral insight, all ethics must go back to the facts lying in moral cognition and their a priori interconnections. Typical Schelerian language. In short, Scheler tells us that good or right willing is determined, and that the source of this determination is the self-givenness of values, which is not epistemic determination, cognitive determination in any sense of the term. Soloviev is no less clear in this same regard. In the fifth part of the Introduction to Justification, entitled Moral Philosophy as a Science, he writes about rational liberty, that in no manner of fashion is arbitrary or accidental. On the contrary, although a will sensitive to the moral law, that is to the good, is free of the lower psychological biological necessities, it is not free of the internal and superior necessity of the absolute good. He concludes, voila, a small remark about the Russian there. Not only is ethics compatible with determinism, it makes possible the most superior form of necessity. When a man who has attained a high degree of moral consciousness knowingly submits his will to the idea of the good, having come to know and penetrate it fully and profoundly, it is evident that in his submission to the moral law there is no kind of arbitrary will, that it is, on the contrary, completely necessary. Oh. The Russian is not mine. And the Russian is not in the text. The Russian was done yesterday evening by Google Translate on my computer in the hotel room. So. And except for the last sentence, that's not too bad, I think. So, bravo for Google Translate. All right. Soloviev seems closer than Scheler to Socrates' judgmental knowledge of norms, when he writes that moral consciousness supposes having come to know and fully penetrate the idea of the good, as if judgmental knowledge of the good suffices to determine the will. However, the first chapter of Justification can be read as an explanation of what it means to speak of a man with a highly developed moral consciousness. This person is someone who has grown sensitive to the presence and the pull of the good in her profound, initially negative experience of shame. The experience of shame grants a person the occasion for moral insight that axiologically is at once negatively and positively charged. Negatively, because in shame the person becomes cognizant of her moral depredation. Positively, because that experience alone already contains, at the same time, a call to moral perfection, to recognize that the task is to strive for the realization of the good beyond the confines of the mere self. So, the knowledge in question is, to quote a title from some years ago, love's knowledge. There's a kind of loving, there's a right kind of loving. It is not for us to choose what to love, if and to the extent that we have not obstructed our access to genuine values. The good that Soloviev was so keen to justify is the good which justifies our right loving. The position overall as represented by Soloviev and Scheler is neatly stated by Dahm as follows. Okay, time? Okay. Dahm writes as follows. Here's the text. Oh, well. Oops. Well done. Soloviev and Scheler have shown that one must push forward by the intuition of love, necessarily to a highest, original, universally creative, and individual spiritual person. It is this must that attracts my attention. It is a striking summary in this expression in this summary statement. Another commentator, the second quotation there, of Scheler's philosophy writes that since for Scheler the ordo amoris, possibly the basic moral tenor of a person, and the milieu are not subject to conscious information, he effectively denies human freedom. All that we are and can be are dependent upon a conversion experience in the form of a recognition and a response to something outside, beyond ourselves. This writer sees a fundamental problem here, that of determination. The last quotation. We are attuned in an a priori order to objects, situations, and persons bearing values. This order determines the value structure of a person. That is what a person desires and averse to in the things that are present and available to him. So at one level, we are determined by our milieu. It impacts our drives and inclinations. We could say, following Heidegger, that we are geworfen. But in addition, Scheler believes that moral insight determines us at a more fundamental level, since by failing to submit to the order of values, by succumbing instead to moral depredation, we undermine our will, our sense of self, the essential structure of our moral nature. For his part, Soloviev persisted in speaking about our voluntary, free submission to the moral order, a submission that likewise follows from a conversion experience sensitive to what calls us to unite with it. After all, he was the great champion of asceticism as the royal road to moral insight and well-being. Now, I am well aware that what I'm saying about Soloviev's relation to Kant may be controversial. For example, and voilà, noch einmal. Please. Voilà. In an essay devoted to Soloviev's anthropology, Randall Poole underscores the degree to which the Russian philosopher embraced Kant's ethics. He writes, quotation, "It is clear that Soloviev's concept of rational autonomy is deeply indebted to Kant's ethics in two ways. First, Kant's idea of the autonomy of the will is the core notion of human freedom that Soloviev accepts in his own work. Second, Kant's idea that human dignity consists in rational autonomy is Soloviev's basic understanding as well." End of quote. However, Poole goes on to note that the real source of human dignity for Soloviev is, I quote, "the human principle of autonomy, of self-determination according to our consciousness of the absolute or divine." The italics are mine. Now, while Soloviev may have emulated Kantian ethics in principle, I am not clear that rational autonomy informed by a consciousness of the divine absolute preserves the Kantian idea of self-determination. Indeed, reacting to Kant's so-called postulates of practical reason, Soloviev declares in justification that God and the soul are not postulates of the moral law, as Kant held, but the direct creative forces of moral reality. An affirmation to which Poole, in his commentary, adds the following: ones that are directly given in moral experience. Now, unless I misunderstand Vladimir Soloviev entirely,
Harry Frankfurt is calling. Я напишу, что
Unless I misunderstand Soloviev entirely, the moral experience he draws attention to in justification is a response to a call in Scheler's sense, to a task grounded in the nature of the moral order that love of the right kind displays to us. It is therefore... No. Okay, the conclusion here seems to be the following. Insofar as Soloviev and Scheler appeal to objective values in one form or another, what they are saying is that I should freely choose to let my will be determined by something outside of me, by something that is greater than I am. To put it rather bluntly, I should knowingly and freely choose heteronomy, be this glossed as union, self-transcendence, or some other candidate for submission. I'm going to come now to Harry Frankfurt. There have always been skeptics about the existence of objective values. The current widespread conviction among Anglo-American philosophers that... Hello? Hello? Hey, no, don't too much. No?
Yeah.
Well, the conviction among Anglo-American philosophers that naturalism is the only philosophically tenable position over the entire range of issues philosophers investigate makes talk of it.
Презентацию включили.
Ну, я понимаю, я пытаюсь включить звук.
Мир коммуникации. Если вы что-то ужасное на свете, то без края.
Можно, Андрюш, еще нам?
Теперь я не могу обратно включить презентацию.
Окей. Могу просто так говорить, если хотите. Да. Naturalists today tend to say that objective values, talk of objective values is either entirely queer or a mere façon de parler. There are, of course, defenders of so-called moral realism who affirm that there are moral facts and that these make true or false beliefs we hold about the right thing to do, about the wrong thing to do. Thank you. However, most moral realists stake out their position within, not outside the naturalist framework, where there is no obvious room for a realm of objective values. Moral facts, in other words, are not ontologically speaking objective values a la Soloviev Scheler. And as for the will, many other philosophers today, starting already with Hume, however, who have questioned whether there is such a thing, is not talk of the will quite simply fallacious. Where motivation is concerned, we might be able to get along entirely with belief, desire, and intention, and consign our talk of the will completely to silence. Now, in this setting, Harry Frankfurt is something of an outsider. He's not a realist about values, but he nevertheless insists that love is the key to understanding our moral psychology, our willing. I say nevertheless because Frankfurt challenges us to think of love as, so to speak, intransitive, in that what is loved need not be antecedently, inherently worthy of love, whereas it is exceedingly important that we do love tout court. Having grappled with the Baroque splendors of Kant's moral doctrine and Soloviev's and Scheler's cosmic essentialism of the good, Frankfurt, I must say, is a refreshing read. He comes across as an alchemist pruning away adventitious entities that obscure what we should pay attention to when we are concerned with moral psychology. What is it on his terms that we ought to pay attention to? Let's see if the machine does its work. Yes. The will we have, надо читать снизу стрелки, да? The will we have or don't have is the will we ourselves have constructed. How do we do this? We do so by choosing to hold something as important, by caring for something. This can happen when, in the succession and tumult of desires that move us now one way, now another, we settle on some desire that we reflectively identify with as the one we want to motivate our will. We want what we want. We identify with that second order want, and this gives us structure. The will is about maintaining the structure and sustains the caring. Given what we care about and identify with, certain things become necessary to nourish our care, while others become unthinkable. Or in case we are assailed by conflicting desires that threaten our identification with what we care about, we succeed nevertheless at keeping them at bay. We do not let them undermine the structure of our will. When we truly care, as Frankfurt says, when we truly care, as Frankfurt says, when we truly care, as Frankfurt says. Voilà. The heart of the matter is neither affective nor cognitive. It is volitional. Loving has less to do with what a person believes or how she feels than with a configuration of the will that consists in a practical concern for what is good for the beloved. And it is because there is this configuration of the will that the question of value is turned on its head. Whether or not we are struck by what we take to be the value of something that attracts us, Frankfurt declares that it is not necessarily as a result of recognizing their value and of being captivated by it that we love things. Rather, what we love necessarily acquires value for us because we love it. The value the lover sees it to possess is a value that derives from and depends upon his love. There is no metaphysical ground here determining the will, either from within or from without the person. It may be that a given person cares about nothing, or that she fails to reflectively identify with what she wants, and over time becomes what Frankfurt calls a wanton. This today, something else tomorrow, or nothing at all. Huh? It will do no good to appeal to such a person's higher moral sense, for that only begs the issue at hand. Why care about being moral in the first place? The stroke that softens the volitional necessity that caring imposes on the person comes entirely from the person's attitude to herself, her being wholehearted about what she cares about. She loves herself. While it may appear that care or love creates value in a somewhat arbitrary way, as Frankfurt presents it, the authentic basis for ascribing values to the beloved, as Harry Frankfurt thinks, is our wholeheartedness, which is the sign that this person treats loving itself as important. We love to love, and therefore seek to engage with the world around us in a way that only care is able to. For those not familiar with Frankfurt's work, I assume that's the greater majority here, I believe I have said enough to mark the contrast between his views and those held by advocates of objective values and determination of the will, and who appeal to love or response to the good as the way to go beyond the mere self as far as possible. Frankfurt's construction of the will has been described as a bootstrapping operation, or if you prefer, a case of Baron Munchausen pulling himself out of the swamp by his own hair. Yeah? At the beginning of this presentation, I stated that my three protagonists all take a stand with respect to Kant's ethic. Kant himself held that love is a matter of feeling, I'm quoting, not of willing. So a duty to love, he says, is an absurdity. And of course, duty is where Kant locates the essence of the will's self-determination. Love, as we saw with Scheler and Soloviev, corrects the Kantian formalist ethic, though to a degree which raises the specter of a paradoxical heteronomy, willing to be determined by what we recognize as calling us to love it. Frankfurt is by far the sleeker, the neater champion of love. We construct our will thanks to what we wholeheartedly care, and we owe it to ourselves to love someone or something. So all you need is love. I know. Спасибо.
Замечательное окончание доклада. И я прошу задавать вопросы. Да, Владимир Белов.
По-русски?
Да, конечно, да.
Да, можно. Ну, вот еще один аспект проблемы любви. Как бы он немножко оказался в стороне, но, может быть, он где-то вот у вас все-таки присутствует, эстетический. То есть вы говорили, да, о взаимодействии, значит, гносеологического, этического, ну и прежде всего ценностного момента. Но, в общем-то, есть еще один, да, вот сюжет, связанный с эстетическим аспектом. Он как-то, ну, имплицитно где-то там присутствует, или вообще маргинальным оказывается вот в этих построениях?
Но Соловьева оправдание добра, теоретическая философия, переход на феноменологию, как бы эстетический момент там не играет никакой роли. Дело в том, что как мы строим нашу волю. No? Для Франкфурта было бы интересно задать этот вопрос. Он сказал так: может быть, вы человек, который очень любит искусство. И вы в состоянии узнать этого и устроить на этой основе вашу волю. Всю мою жизнь это будет эстетическая воля. Тогда вы имеете смысл и цель вашей жизни. И вот и все. Без ценности, без такого понятия воли, что воля должна отвечать на что-то уже объективно данное, так что эстетические ценности действительно как бы определяют мое сознание. Нет. Это с той причины, что я люблю такие ценности, или я придаю вещам такие ценности, что я строю свою волю.
Thanks, this was really interesting. Maybe just to problematize Kant's concept.
Okay, so thank you very much for a really interesting talk. Just a brief comment to problematize a little bit Kant's concept of love that you referred to in the end. You pointed out this, that love is a matter, or this quotation that love is a matter of feeling, not of willing.
Yeah.
But if you go further in the same work, the Metaphysics of Morals in the Doctrine of Virtue, we do get a notion of what Kant calls practical love, which is precisely a matter of willing. And if you compare what Kant says about that love to some of the quotations that you had from Frankfurt, it might actually look quite similar, even though there is another kind of justification for that, which is how Kant justifies the duty of benevolence. So my comment is that Kant's concept of love is multifaceted and not reducible maybe to the emotion of love. My question from this perspective would be that if Frankfurt's thesis is that you should just love wholeheartedly, and you look at the examples, the kind of context where it talks about love, they are context what the evolutionists would call context of inclusive fitness, right? So you would love your children, your friends, maybe your spouse. And the Kantian question would be, is this enough for an ethics of love? What do you think about this?
I fully accept the question, and I'm not sure I have an answer to your question. We might even go further. Are you familiar with the book, Reasons of Love and Other Texts?
A little bit. I'm not an expert on Frankfurt.
In many discussions that have taken place with him, at a certain moment, he says openly that as far as he's concerned, Hitler and Stalin had perfectly good lives. They loved, no? Hitler was very happy with what he did, so therefore he constructed a very good will for himself. Of course, for most of us, ужас, no как, no? Stalin the same thing. But you can't move Frankfurt. He doesn't retreat from his position. He doesn't want, nominalistically shall we speak, to admit the existence of some sort of realm of values. And he's entirely happy with this idea that we construct our own wills by loving the things we do. So in the long run, the answer to your question is really in a text that he gave as a series of lectures. He simply will look at you and say, do you take yourself seriously? Taking ourselves seriously. And if you do, that means you have to find the meaning of your life, as we sometimes said. So the ethics of love here, of course, has nothing to do with romantic love. In fact, he often says that romantic love is the worst possible example that a philosopher might use to examine what love is really all about. You're quite right that he says certain things we can't help loving. A mother can't help loving her children. That's the naturalism. That's the biological basis of somebody. And he builds on that because he recognizes there's more than a mother's love for her child. But nevertheless, this kind of fundamental identification with that which is important for me is enough for Frankfurt at every level to account for our moral well-being.
Спасибо.
Вот Веса Ойтинен указал на Спинозу и на понятие amor intellectualis Dei, говорил, что там присутствует материальная этика, то есть материальные ценности. И вопрос такой, влиял ли Спиноза в этом плане на Соловьева? Я так понял.
Да, спасибо.
We have настоящий специалист по Соловьеву. Касается, читал он и как Спиноза или нет. Конечно, он читал Спиноза, мы знаем. Конечно, да. Но что касается вопроса узкого определения морали или этики у Соловьева на основе текста как оправдание добра, я просто не в состоянии сказать. Там, по-моему, Спиноза не называется. Или нет? Даже нет.
Есть понятие
Дискуссия, да? Во-первых. Во-вторых, моя задача, я представляю мою задачу в довольно узком смысле. Вопрос будет такой. Воля нам уже дана, или мы конструируем нашу волю? Если конструируем нашу волю, то значит должен быть где-то там источник нормативности нашей воли. Но есть, как я старался показать, по крайней мере, два возможности на основе моего текста. Либо этот источник будет объективен, ценности никакой, такой моральный порядок мира и так дальше, Соловьев. Или можно назвать субъективистским в никаком смысле, но не в жестком смысле психологизма. Но скорее то, что я хотел там сказать, что вот мы в состоянии таком, что для нас вещи, how would you say, become important for us?
Становится важным.
That we care about. Это вот это вопрос моральной психологии. Да. Как решаете любви? На основе чего? Потому что папа и мама сказали, вот есть такие источники морали, ты должен. Да? Или это ничего вам не говорит, я знаю, что я хочу. И кроме всего там других вещей вы делаете. Франкфурт говорит, это хорошо. Это wholehearted. Да?
Спасибо, Борис Межуев. Да, по-русски.
Вы знаете, вы привели трех мыслителей, которые говорили о любви. И у меня возникает такое предположение или гипотеза, или смутное сомнение, что первый и третий из них не имеют отношения к моральной философии, когда говорят о любви. Что касается Соловьева и что касается Франкфурта, которого я не знаю, и в данном случае исхожу только из ваших слов. Что касается Соловьева, то ведь он говорил не просто о любви, он говорил о сексуальной любви, о половой любви. То есть речь идет не вообще о возлюби ближнего своего, как сказано в Евангелии, и о там, возлюби Господа Бога своего как самого себя. Он говорит, in the meaning of love, он говорит совершенно определенно о любви в половом сексуальном смысле этого слова. без всякой, так сказать, какого-то иного подтекста, так сказать. Вот. И пытается рассуждать о смысле именно этой любви, уже вполне конструируемой не какими-то отвлеченными ценностями, а конструируемой конкретным физическим влечением. И вот об этом он рассуждает конкретно в этом вопросе. В этом смысле, конечно, это очевидно не то, что Макс Шелер, мне кажется. А что касается Гарри Франкфурта, не кажется ли вам, что в той ситуации, когда объект любви, дело даже не в объекте любви, когда сама направленность любви никак так сказать, не имеет отношения к ценностям, то в этом смысле сама эта любовь, как чувственная склонность, может быть абсолютно лишена. То есть это как нечто, так сказать, как желание, там, я люблю суп, я люблю компот, а я люблю, так сказать, детей, причем не вот в том самом первом смысле этого слова. То есть речь в данном случае идет о описании чувственной психологической склонности, может быть, само по себе интересной с психологической точки зрения, но к моральной философии отношения не имеющей. Или я не
Первый цитат Франкфурта. The heart of the matter is neither effective nor cognitive, it is volitional. Там чувственности нет. По крайней мере, в том смысле, как он он казывается, что это только inclination, desire в том смысле. Да? Потому что в той заботе, о которой мы говорили, есть самоидентификация с том, что мне нравится, как бы так. Да? И вот тогда строим свою волю. Что касается Соловьева, ну, мы раньше об этом уже сегодня говорили, я знаю ваше мнение, и слышали сейчас мой. Что мне интересует, это вот эта как бы феноменология в смысле дама, в оправдании добра, три уровня: стыд, жалость и благодарение. Да. Я читаю их в смысле самого Шелера, это такая иерархия. И высший ступень обусловлен низшим ступенем. То значит, если у меня стыда нет, то жалости невозможно, потому что тогда я остаюсь в своем эгоизме. Да? Як я в общине вместе с другими на основе жалости готов буду узнать, что между нами существует как и моральный порядок, то мы ходим дальше и выше ступень. И в том смысле я говорю о любви. То не будет тогда чувственная вещь, то не будет, конечно, эрос, может быть, тоже эрос там, конечно, на втором уровне, да, но, так сказать, такая ориентация, диспозиция нашей воли, да, куда добро. И то, что Шелер называет ответ, да, на то, что больше, чем я, и что я могу как бы тоже стать, если буду стараться. Да? В том смысле любовь.
Спасибо большое. Еще вопрос есть? У нас есть время на один маленький вопрос. Да, Фредерик.
So I know that Helmut Dahm, in his book, he says that there is most probably no influence from Soloviev to Scheler, right? That there's probably no historical connection. But he didn't take into account the fact that in 1914, Scheler wrote a review of Masaryk's book on Russian philosophy, and then Der Formalismus appeared in 1916.
Yeah.
So,
I'm aware, yeah.
Do you have an opinion on that?
I have no. Munich was filled with Russians at the time, from the end of the 19th century into before the First World War. He clearly had contacts with people, Scheler, I mean, and so maybe he actually heard something about Vladimir Soloviev. I mean, Soloviev was dead in the year 1900, and Scheler finished his doctoral dissertation, I think, in 1896. In that kreis of very mixed intellectuals, Russians and Germans, in Munich. So it's more than possible. You could say it's really likely, but there's no proof. That's the only problem. He didn't know Russian, as far as I know. So it wouldn't be a direct influence.
But he did read Masaryk.
Yeah.
Well, some people write reviews without reading.
Masaryk published his text written in German, wasn't it?
Ja. Russische Geistesgeschichte Religionsunterricht.
So you're referring to the Masoretic text then would of course have had the chapters on Soloviev,
Yes.
and he would have become. I don't know. It's a good question, but how could one make it deeper? I don't know.
Kant doesn't mention that at all in his book, so it's something you overlook.
If that's the case, I believe you. I couldn't tell you one way or the other right now.